Hello, my name is Blake McDonald, and I am a grant specialist at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. I'm pleased to be with you today to discuss the department's LGBTQ plus Heritage Initiative. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources is the state's historic preservation office. Every state and territory has a similar office and has since the mid 1960s with the signing of the Federal National Historic Preservation Act. You can see our mission on the screen here. It's quite broad: to foster, encourage, and support the stewardship of Virginia's significant historic architecture, archaeology, and cultural resources. Some of our program areas that you might be more familiar with include the National Register of Historic Places and the Coordinate Virginia Landmarks Register. That's sort of like the honor roll of important places here in the state of Virginia. Properties that are listed on the National Register can take advantage of our robust rehabilitation tax credit program. We have both state and federal tax credits that provide dollar for dollar income tax liability reductions for property owners who fix up their old buildings according to a set of standards that honor their historic character. And then finally, we have our historical highway marker program. I'm sure you're all familiar with the silver and black signs along Virginia's roads. We do have the oldest highway marker program in the nation, and we are adding dozens of highway markers to our roads every year. And unlike in the early days of historic preservation, where we focused our efforts on just a small slice of our shared history, today the mission of the Department of Historic Resources encompasses the story of all Virginians. We can look to our historical highway marker program as an example of this shift. Only 20% of our historical highway markers in the state of Virginia focus on topics related to minority populations: women, African American folks, indigenous communities. However, more than 60% of the new highway markers that we are erecting every year focus solely on African American history. That's not counting the many other markers that are going up focused on other minority communities. So you can see that we are trying to right this long-standing imbalance. And part of that effort to better represent the history of all Virginians is our LGBTQ Heritage Initiative. So first, a little bit of background. LGBTQ is the common acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. We tend to use queer as an umbrella term that encompasses all of these identities and gender expressions and more. LGBTQ history encompasses same-sex love, desire, and gender variance. It is broadly the study of people who embraced non-traditional lifestyles through different forms of affection, identity, and expression. People who today might identify as LGBTQ or queer, even though this terminology is relatively new. One thing to keep in mind as we move through this presentation today is that these modern words, they are just that. They are recent, and they came into common use, phrases like gay or lesbian, after World War II. And so while queer people have always been present in Virginia and across the world, they didn't use the same words or even concepts that we do today. And that's why we focus on that concept of non-traditional attachments and lifestyles. You can see in the picture here Julian Woodglass Jr. and R. Lee Taylor, two men who were coupled for many decades and started the renowned Museum of the Shenandoah Valley up in Winchester, Virginia, where they live together. At the Department of Historic Resources, our LGBTQ Heritage Initiative began in the spring of 2015. That's right around when the National Park Service, which is kind of like our coordinate agency within the federal government, released its LGBTQ history theme study. You can see that the cover of that theme study on the screen here. And the theme study laid out all the reasons why it's important to include LGBTQ history in historic preservation. It encouraged state historic preservation offices like DHR to take up this mantle and begin exploring places in their own state that included LGBTQ significance. So in order to do that, we took a number of first steps. First, we engaged scholars and preservationists, folks who are already working in this space, to come together and to share with us some of the places and the themes that they had been researching to put each other into conversation and community so that we could all assist one another. We began documenting LGBTQ associated historic places through architectural survey throughout the state, encouraging national parks, heritage areas, and other history organizations to interpret LGBTQ stories associated with them. And then a goal of the initiative has always been to increase the number of LGBTQ associated properties on the Virginia Landmarks Register and the National Register of Historic Places, as well as our historical highway marker program. There's value in LGBTQ history not only because it provides us with a new lens to more fully understand the past, but also because we look to history to find our identity in the present. Everyone, every community deserves to have a past and to understand where they come from. And in the words of historian David Lowenthal, a past lacking tangible relics seems too tenuous to be credible. So this is where this work begins to overlap with historic preservation, because really it is the value of identifying and uplifting the physical places, the extant buildings, sites, structures, parks where this happened, where this history happened. And that's what sets DHR's initiative apart from some of the other work that's been going on in the LGBTQ history sphere, which is that it really is a place-based approach. We are using the language of historic preservation by looking at existing places, historic resources, to map the people, events, and spaces that make up LGBTQ history in Virginia. A few examples on the screen here. We have Sister Rosetta Tharpe, considered the godmother of rock and roll, lived for over a decade here in the city of Richmond, and her house in the North Side neighborhood still stands. We've got Monroe Park in the middle, right at the center of the VCU campus, where several of the earliest LGBTQ student activist events of the 1970s took place. And finally, we have Linden Row, which was saved by early preservationist Mary Wingfield Scott. Scott was in several long-term relationships with women over her life, even adopted children with one of those partners. And Scott is the individual who really lobbied the city to start city of Richmond to start a historic preservation program, and herself purchased many at-risk historic buildings and rehabilitated them in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So how did the LGBTQ Heritage Initiative roll out in its first couple of years? Well, in addition to the meetings of scholars that I mentioned just a moment ago, kind of our starting point, we developed web content. We engaged some wonderful interns to build a web page for us, stock it with materials like a statewide timeline, bibliographies, and more. All of that is still available on our webpage, our DHR webpage. We've identified over 100 places across the state of Virginia associated with LGBTQ history and posted many of them to various maps linked on our webpage. And perhaps most important in our early years was our presence at Virginia Pride Fest, which takes place each fall in Richmond. For the 4 years leading up to COVID, we rented a booth, we shared our project, we provided content like printed out local walking tours, and we answered questions that people had when they came to engage with us. We were the first state agency in 2015 to have a booth at Pride Fest. One product of the initiative that folks might find particularly engaging is our architectural survey of LGBTQ historic sites in the city of Richmond. A few years ago, we had a particularly ambitious intern who surveyed about 30 key LGBTQ historic sites in the city and produced a beautiful report outlining each place and providing recommendations for further areas of study. This is available as a PDF on our website. Within the last year, we've added information to a newly created ArcGIS story map that's been shared on our social media channels. We have plans to expand this and add more story maps. And we've worked with partner organizations to amplify the places that we are documenting and the stories that we are uplifting. Style Weekly has been a wonderful partner here in Richmond, sharing much of our data. And Historic Richmond, one of our local preservation and advocacy groups, has hosted several talks, and in June hosted a walking tour of Monroe Ward LGBTQ history that I led, and it attracted over 60 participants. As part of our mission to expand LGBTQ history into DHR's existing program areas, like the National Register of Historic Places, the Virginia Landmarks Register, and our Historical Highway Marker program, we are very pleased to announce that we have approved and are soon to install the first state historical highway marker focused on the history of LGBTQ community in Arlington County, focused on Dr. Lily Bachins, who is a journalist, filmmaker, and psychotherapist, empowered the gay civil rights movement of the 1960s, was one of the handful of folks at the state's first gay rights protest at the White House and then at the Pentagon in 1965, co-founder of the Washington Blade, a still running and very important LGBTQ newspaper, started back in 1969. And in Arlington, where the Chins lived for much of her life, she hosted the Women Gay Open House in Columbia Heights from 1971 to 1979. This open house provided weekly gatherings that allowed lesbian, bisexual, women seeking women or questioning their sexuality to meet in comfort and safety, and was really part of what developed that area of Northern Virginia's LGBTQ community at that time. The residence that the Chins lived in and hosted folks in looks very different than it did originally. So it's not a great fit for the National Register of Historic Places, which requires a degree of historic integrity. However, it does make it a perfect candidate for the Historical Highway Marker program, which does not rely on extant historic places, but instead marks the location of important events or where someone lived. And so that highway marker should be installed soon. And I do want to be very clear as I talk about the work that DHR is doing, that we are certainly not the only place in Virginia, nor even in the city of Richmond, who are exploring LGBTQ history as an important topic right now. You can see here a long and incomplete list of organizations who are doing this work already. And that's not counting the many wonderful individual researchers and historians who are also performing LGBTQ historical research and interpretation. So I view one of the primary functions of DHR's LGBTQ History Initiative as collecting some of these sources and putting them out to the public to serve as kind of a clearinghouse, as well as to show the things that we've surveyed and researched ourselves. So now we're going to move on to a handful of research resources. And as we do, I want to focus on a couple of topics that will come up consistently. One is that LGBTQ history is not solely a history of oppression, but you have to keep in mind that there are still barriers to living openly as a queer person. And if you rewind 20, 50, or 100 years, those barriers are even greater, and they're often codified in local, state, or federal law. I think the most pertinent example of this in Virginia is that it was actually illegal, according to alcoholic beverage control regulation, to employ or serve homosexuals at establishments with liquor licenses until 1991. So many of the places that we discuss and the sources that we point to, they do embody some element of oppression, identities that were purposefully concealed, venues that were shuttered due to discriminatory laws like that ABC regulation, and then more recently, the activism that was intended and succeeded in permitting greater freedoms and acceptance. You also have to keep in mind that LGBTQ history has been purposefully obscured by others who wanted to erase the past evidence of LGBTQ lives. So loving same-sex relationships still get relegated to the realm of companions, gender variance, dismissed as mental instability. This censorship has been purposeful, and it's intended to cast LGBTQ people as isolated or aberrant to discourage the acceptance of non-heteronormative behaviors and identities. So when you combine these two factors, past queer people's efforts to protect themselves, protect their identities, and this long-standing censorship, you wind up with a topic that can be very challenging to research in a traditional manner. To identify LGBTQ historical people and places, you simply can't expect to find the same type of source material that you would in other branches of historical research. So we do rely on sources that have traditionally been considered unreliable, things like word of mouth, rumor, reference, secret codes. These all become really valuable in the area of queer history. And so you wind up casting a very wide net to include people who might not have in their own time identified as LGBTQ, and even potentially, outing folks who are not here to speak for themselves. But the fact of the matter is that historical interpretation does require us to talk about the past using modern ideas, and you never really have any true proof of anyone's sexuality or gender expression. Heterosexual marriage, children, none of these things are a smoking gun to prove that someone is straight. So while we can't say how any of the folks who we discussed through some of these topics, especially before the LGBTQ rights movement of the 1960s and 70s, would identify today, I do want to consider, do you stand to lose anything by looking at their non-traditional lifestyles and relationships and identifying them as part of this LGBTQ community? I would argue, of course, that this does nothing to diminish their story, but instead it actually portrays a richer and more nuanced understanding of their lives. And finally, when you're studying LGBTQ history and looking at the resources that are available to you, you will find lots of instances where someone's wealth or power, agency, or race makes their story more available, makes it better represented within archival collections. Very few folks could live relatively openly, and those who could often had some degree of agency, affluence, or privilege to back up that non-traditional lifestyle. So that's a key thing to consider when you begin thinking about the resources that are available to you. So I'm going to start with a handful of important archival collections that can be of use to LGBTQ historical researchers. These are physical places that you would still need to make an appointment and go visit. And they consist primarily of documents pertaining to queer activism in different parts of the state of Virginia from the 1970s on. The VCU collection, for example, includes the Records for Equality Virginia, our present-day state advocacy organization, as well as several earlier grassroots organizations like the Virginia Gay Alliance, Gay Awareness and Perspective, and the Gay Rights Associations. While you would still need to visit many of these places in person, they all do have finding guides that can be accessed online for those physical collections. Some newer collections have been digitized, and I'm including those on the slide you see before you. The Virginia Tech Online Archive includes some wonderful digitized materials from early LGBTQ student organizations located at that university, as well as a series of oral history recordings that include narratives expanding beyond the campus into Blacksburg and Roanoke. The Southwest Virginia History Project Digital Archive includes serials like Blue Ridge Lambda Alliance newsletter, which was published out of Lynchburg in the 1980s and 90s. A very important source of LGBTQ news in Central and Tidewater, Virginia was On Our Own Community Press, which was published out of Norfolk and ran from 1976 to 1998. That digital archive is entirely keyword searchable. So if you're researching a specific LGBTQ bar, for example, or an event that took place at a certain time, you can use that keyword search function. And finally, we have Mapping the Gay Guides, which provides digital entries of Bob Dameron's address book, one of the most popular gay travel guides. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the Green Book used by African American travelers in the early and mid 20th century. The exact same thing functioned for the LGBTQ community, guidebooks for gay men, for lesbian women, for many folks who were living queer lifestyles. And the Dameron Address book was probably the most popular for gay men, and that is now all searchable and mapped through the project linked here. And then it is important to point out that we can use some general sources that were created by and for cis straight audiences with an eye towards LGBTQ history. Newspaper archives like our Richmond Times-Dispatch include loads of articles about queer topics, and I think it is really valuable to see how LGBTQ people were being written about and by and for a largely straight audience. This is sort of the cultural framing that we do need to understand when we're doing this type of work. We can also use locational data like census tract information and historic city directories to figure out where queer individuals lived, where certain businesses were operating. One source that I have not yet accessed, but I think would be very fruitful, is police arrest records. This is an untapped resource that could tell us, where were queer people being arrested who were breaking the law or were perceived to be breaking the law, and what were they being arrested for? That could create some really interesting mapping of, where were queer people gathering during certain periods. And finally, we have personal papers. Notable queer individuals may have left documentary materials that can provide insights into who they spent their time with and how, but you do have to keep in mind that these collections not only pertain to individuals who already had power, authority, wealth, something that caused their papers to be kept on at a repository, but also that these collections are often heavily edited before they're made available to the public. So you might only be getting a snippet view of their life. On the screen here, we have articles from the Richmond Times-Dispatch pertaining to a lawsuit where VCU, the first LGBTQ VCU student group, sued for equal funding and access to other amenities allowed to other clubs at the university, and eventually did win in the mid-1970s. And then a much older newspaper article referring to Louis Genter, the tobacco magnate and philanthropist who developed much of Richmond following the Civil War, and his long-term romantic partner, John Pope, and the very clouded or couched language that was used to describe their partnership following Pope's death in 1896. And to end, I want to share a handful of questions that I think it is important to ask when researching LGBTQ people in order to build a compelling historical narrative, because you do so infrequently find that smoking gun that I've already mentioned to prove someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. I feel that these questions can help to illustrate those non-traditional lifestyles and kind of that broader sense of queerness. So we have questions that I've already touched on, like who were the defining and significant relationships in the lives of the people you're looking at? Who was in their social circle? For folks like famous author Ellen Glasgow, who lived in Richmond all her life, not only did she have a long-standing romantic relationship with Anne Virginia Bennett, who went on to publish her autobiography, Glasgow's autobiography, after Glasgow's death, but also was quite good friends with the first openly lesbian novelist, Radcliffe Hall. So you begin creating this kind of social network that includes queer or non-traditional folks. Moving on beyond that, how do both period and modern sources describe these folks, their relationships, and their social networks? In cases like Ginter and Pope, where you have newspaper articles describing them as close companions who never sought the company of women. What can you read into that? Who is the primary beneficiary of someone's will? So passing down of property was a great way to convey benefits to partners who could not be legally recognized. In the case of one of the first licensed Black female architects in the nation, Amasa Lee Meredith, who lived down in Petersburg, she willed her home to Edna Mead Colson following her death, allowing Colson to continue living there for several years. So that's an important clue there. A question that folks often overlook: how and where were LGBTQ people interred? The way that they are buried, who they're buried with, can be very, very telling. I mentioned earlier Mary Wingfield Scott, the great preservationist of Richmond in the 20th century. Scott is actually buried in Hollywood Cemetery with her second sort of major partner, with whom she was in a relationship for about 30 years, Rachel Wilson, and that co-interment, that burying together, I think gives a great indication of the value that those women held for each other and the relationship that they had. And then who's responsible for their legacy? Who gets to curate that legacy for folks who maybe, as we've discussed, leaving papers to a repository? Who gets to sort of carry on the stories? Is it a family member, or is it these close partners who never had potentially legal or recognized status? And then when you're looking at specific places, another handful of questions you can ask: who owned, operated, or managed things like bars, restaurants, clubs? Were these known queer individuals within the community that you're looking? Where and how were places advertised if they were public? Were they advertised in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, or were they advertised in On Our Own community press? Are there records for who used these places? Are there oral histories that talk about how these spaces were utilized and who went there and when? For example, here in the city of Richmond, we have wonderful oral histories that are kept at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture from a LGBTQ, a gay male resident of Richmond in the 1960s, Bob Swisher, who talks about the importance of the YMCA on Franklin Street as a gathering place for gay men. And then again, how is this place documented? Is it documented in the popular press? If so, is it documented because it's being raided by alcoholic beverage control officers? Or is it flying under the radar, as so many LGBTQ establishments did, in order to protect themselves from police raids? So a handful of questions to ask specific to queer spaces. So in terms of what's happening next at the Department of Historic Resources and our Heritage Initiative, first and foremost, we do want to continue documenting and sharing places that are associated with Virginia's queer past. We do want to emphasize places associated with Black, Latinx, and Indigenous folks. I have here on the screen the Hippodrome Theater in Richmond's Jackson Ward. It's one of only a handful of places in the city of Richmond that we've directly associated with Black queer history in the city. And then we've also just determined eligible the home of an important Cuban-American LGBTQ activist here in Richmond, Tony Segura, and his partner, gay pulp fiction author Marsh Harris. Beyond that, we do want to continue expanding some of these queer historic places into our programs through the historic registers and the highway marker program, listing and identifying more spaces with LGBTQ historic significance. All of these programs do rely on outside property owners and community groups expressing their support and encouraging the agency to push these things either towards nomination status or towards highway marker erection. And so, these programs are in very high demand, but the best way that many members of the public can kind of support this work is by encouraging the listing and similar designation of spaces that are important to LGBTQ history in your own community. And finally, a reach goal for our initiative is the development of a statewide text on LGBTQ history. This would be sort of like a textbook, a large report that documents the development of queer communities all across Virginia, providing much of the background research and sources that would be needed to support things like listing of LGBTQ places on the National Register or through highway markers. The states of Maryland and Kentucky both have such context studies, so we have some really good examples, and we are exploring grant funds that may be able to support this work. So please do stay tuned. The best way to find out what's going on with our LGBTQ Heritage Initiative is by visiting our webpage, dhr.virginia.gov, or signing up for our social media channels. Thanks so much.
So the goal of our project is to really broaden people's knowledge of the city's LGBTQ history beyond what most people know, and that's Stonewall. And we want to really connect that history to the places that we walk past every day. And we also want to impact LGBTQ youth who, may feel isolated. They're not taught this history. It's not passed down to them, and they don't see themselves represented in history. But they have really great role models in history. And right here we have James Baldwin, the great activist and writer. And we use this slide associated with sites connected to Baldwin to work with high school students and teachers in the New York City public school system in partnership with the Department of Education to get them thinking about the kinds of places and the neighborhoods where Baldwin was, see how it shaped his life as a Black gay man, writer, and activist. And I should say all of these sites, I'm just going to be touching on a little bit of history, the ones I talk about today, but you can, if you're interested, find more in-depth histories on our website. So another way to go into this history is we've created these thematic collections, and I've just put a sampling here. We have about 40 in total, and this kind of gives you an idea of the themes that we want people to think about when they think about queer history. We have themes dedicated to time periods like 1970s lesbian activism and community, activism before Stonewall, which is really important. There was activism, queer activism happening before Stonewall, and also pre-20th century history, groups of people, transgender history, Asian American and Pacific Islander, Hispanic heritage, cultural and artistic movements. The Harlem Renaissance was very, very queer. And places where the community has faced discrimination, but in many cases has organized and fought back, including themes like homophobia and transphobia and the AIDS crisis. And as Blake was telling you about earlier, the National Register is also an important component of our project. These are the sites that we have listed in New York City, specifically for LGBTQ significance. In 1999, the Stonewall Inn became the very first in the country to be listed specifically for LGBTQ significance. It was written by two of our project founders. It went on to become a National Historic Landmark a year later. And you may now know that it's part of Stonewall National Monument that was designated about in 2016. And so, of course, there are many sites that are on the National Register that could easily be reinterpreted to include LGBTQ history. And that is something that we are doing. We've amended the histories of sites like the Alice Austin House on Staten Island and the Church of the Holy Apostles in Chelsea in Manhattan. And we also have created this map. We co-created this map to help contextualize the Stonewall Uprising. This is sites in the vicinity of Stonewall National Monument. Stonewall is that red box, number 3 on that map. And it helps give a broader understanding of queer life in the vicinity of the monument that dates back well before the 1969 uprising at Stonewall. We have a digital version of this also. But what I thought was really touching years ago when we came out with this physical map was there was a 20-something gay man who was holding this in his hands, and he was emotional to know that he had this queer history. He's holding it in his hand. It really made it so real, and it was really touching to see his reaction. And we also have a digital guide that we recently launched this Some are through the Bloomberg Connects app, which is a free arts and culture app. It finds where, if you have your location settings on, if you open it now, you'll probably get Monticello pop up at the top. But we got permission from the National Park Service to place a little card, as you see, at the monument so that people can, the QR code, download the app and take a self-guided walking tour in the vicinity of the monument. We've also recorded some interviews, including with some activists who lived through this history. Ellen Brody, who helped plan the very first Pride March in 1970, and Randy Wicker, who's been fighting for LGBTQ rights since the late 1950s. And you can also just download this today. You could look through it, listen to it from anywhere, wherever you are. Okay. And then, social media is really important in helping us raise awareness about this history. And as one of my friends says, sometimes you just want the highlights. So this is a nice way to get queer history in your feed. And these are just some of the reels that we've put out on Instagram recently, including a collaboration we did with a group to create this fictional T line on the New York City subway line to celebrate trans history. So riders would go along one subway line, and the voice, actually, one of the voices of the New York City subway, if you're in New York and you hear Bernie Wagon Blast, Bernie came out as transgender a year or two ago and has really made her voice much more of a presence, and so has been a real advocate for trans people. And of course, we like to get out there and with people celebrate this history together. One of our most moving events is our cemetery tours. This one here is from Greenwood Cemetery, a really beautiful cemetery in Brooklyn. We work in partnership with the cemetery to place rainbow flags at the site, at the grave sites of LGBTQ notables. And tour goers get that chance to take a flag and plant it. And I've always kind of wondered if Hollywood Cemetery would be, it's a really great event. We have a trolley and all that. And of course, it's not a big part of what we do, but we have plaques here and there. And this is one for the Cafe Chino, which was the birthplace of Off Broadway and a really important incubator space for gay theater, gay male white theater in the 1960s, at a time when even in New York City on Broadway, it was illegal to depict queer experiences on the stage. And I just wanted to share a few upcoming programs available virtually. Since the pandemic, we've moved towards these virtual programs, which has helped widen their accessibility to people. We have one coming up in October that's going to be focused on the 25-year fight for queer groups to march openly in the St. Patrick's Day Parade on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, which is a huge parade, about over 250 years old. We're going to have an activist who kind of led that fight throughout the years. In November, for Puerto Rican Heritage Month, we're going to have a focus on Puerto Rican queer history with an activist involved with that. And then in December, near World AIDS Day, we're going to be talking about the pink triangle and the famous Silence Equals Death poster with one of the designers of that poster, and look at the evolution of the pink triangle from its origins in the Holocaust to its moving up to the AIDS crisis, and it's obviously still a very relevant symbol today. And so now I'm just going to give you a sampling of LGBTQ history through New York City lens and some ideas of how and where to find it. Some of it is New York City specific, but others can be accessed digitally, so I wanted to point those out as well. And I was going to start with this quote, this great quote from Paula Martinac. It touched on what Blake mentioned earlier. It's from 1997. Because lesbians and gay men have had to hide for such a long time, many of the rules of evidence simply don't apply. In claiming people as gay, I was more interested in looking for how people live their lives, their friends and community, their work, their relationships. And yes, I sometimes relied on rumor and gossip, which has been called the oral history of queer people. So this is back in 97 for her book, The Queerest Place is a Guide to Gay and Lesbian Historic Sites, and that is a national guide. And then here's just some samples of books: Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, History of Lesbian Life in 20th Century America, Transgender History, The Roots of Today's Revolution, and Coming Out Under Fire, The History of Gay Men and Women in World War II. So that's just a handful of books that are available. And so first, just give you some examples of living situations in social circles that give you clues to how queer people lived. And the first one is, personal photos. They're really powerful windows into the queer past when they're available. We see this at house museums like the Alice Austen House on Staten Island, which we refer to as the Alice Austen and Gertrude Tate residence on our website. And next. And these photos here are really great images of Austen and Tate, who were together for 55 years, starting in 1897. And this photo on the left was taken a few years after they met. And the photo on the right was taken in 1944. They lived most of their time together in this house. And Austen was also a pioneering woman photographer whose body of work includes these great images of her friends. And there's so many more. The House Museum digitized a lot of great photos that you can look through. And while it's not possible today to know the exact nature of the relationships in these photos, several stand out as certainly kind of unconventional for their time, like these two from the 1890s. High school, young people always get a kick out of these people in Victorian dress from the 1890s in this way. Okay. And Austen and Tate's home has been turned into a house museum, and that happened in the 1980s. But Tate's central role in Austen's life was not acknowledged, other than that she was her companion. You'll also see, if you're looking at newspaper articles, you might find someone who was a roommate. We've certainly come across that, where you realize later on that that was their life partner, actually. The demonstration on the left here is by the Lesbian Avengers, a group called the Lesbian Avengers in 1994. And they were really advocating that their relationship be acknowledged. And they wanted it. They were, handing out pamphlets and saying that this should be named a National Historic Lesbian Landmark. And that is essentially what happened in 2017. You see us here on the right. We were able to amend the National Register listing for this house. And we're celebrating alongside the staff, National Park Service, and the New York State Historic Preservation Office. And personal letters are also, when they survive, really valuable. This is the Henry Street Settlement, which was founded in the 1890s to provide no-cost medical services to the many poor immigrants who had recently arrived in the city and were living in cramped tenements in this neighborhood, the Lower East Side. Next. It was co-founded by Lillian Wald, a public health nurse and progressive reformer. Author Blanche Wiesen-Cook wrote in 1979 that the details we have make it abundantly clear that Lillian Wald lived in a homosocial world that was also erotic. Her primary emotional needs and desires were fulfilled by women. And to find this, Cook went through 150 boxes of Wald's letters that were archived at Columbia University and the New York Public Library, finding letters that clearly pointed to her romantic relationships with women. And the progressive era there's a definite pattern there where reformers like Wald, who today might identify as lesbian or queer, a very strong presence of these women. They tend to be middle-class white women working in fields like education, social work, and labor reform. And I've given 3 examples on our website of that. So I would say if you're looking to the progressive era, definitely look for signs of same-sex loving women. And so arrest and deportation records, Blake touched on this as well. And so, as I said earlier, there was a sharp increase in the number of working class immigrants arriving from Europe at the turn of the 20th century to New York. And single men made up a big percentage of that. So moral reformers at the time saw this as a big problem. You're going to have a lot of men around all these women and families in crowded tenements. So their solution was to create these wholesome residential hotels for these men. But what they didn't intend was that these hotels became very desirable for gay men, working class gay men. And so, because you could go much more easily undetected, because this is all men in the building. And we know this through the research of author George Chauncey, who includes Mills House No. 1 as one such place in his book, Gay New York, which is a really great read. Very dense, but great. Chauncey went through an unconventional resource, the record books of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, which led the crusade against male homosexuality in the early 20th century. The Society's records included arrests of gay men and where they lived, and Mills House popped up often. It also gives us a great record into working class, white men, but a segment of the population that we may not have learned about otherwise. So that's in Greenwich Village. This is in Greenwich Village, not too far away. Eve's Hangout, which was a very popular gay and lesbian friendly tea room in the basement of this building in the mid-1920s. Next. It was run by a Polish Jewish lesbian immigrant who went by the name Eve Adams. And in 1927, she unfortunately was deported, and this is from her deportation warrant, for being, quote, found in possession of and author of an indecent book. And the indecent book that they're referring to is her book that she wrote in 1925 called Lesbian Love. And so she was deported to Europe. And as a Jewish lesbian unable to return to the US, she was ultimately arrested by the Nazis in 1943 and was murdered at Auschwitz. It's a really terrible story. And then, so media coverage. News stories, although often through tragedy or quote unquote scandal, are sources for uncovering queer history when researching the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is one way we've learned about people who today might identify as transgender or gender variant, and this was the case with Murray Hall. Hall was well known in New York City's political circles and also worked as a bail bondsman in the local police court. And he presented as a heterosexually married man for decades. But after Hall's death in 1901, the New York Times wrote that Hall's doctor revealed, quote unquote, her real sex. And Hall's story attracted worldwide attention as an early undocumented example of what we might call today a gender variant person or a trans person. Though it's not unique, actually, here at the Library of Virginia, we might talk about this. There's an article about a similar story here outside Petersburg, I believe. And there's a reference to someone who recently died in New York. And so I thought, we were talking about this, I thought they meant Murray Hall. So no, there's someone else who was actually in Western New York. So we spoke to a colleague of mine in Buffalo, New York, and we were able to piece that together. So that's an interesting pattern seeing it in the early 1900s. Gay guidebooks are another great resource. In the pre-Stonewall era, these were especially crucial in helping queer people navigate an otherwise hostile landscape when it was legally a crime to be gay. We didn't know much about Mona's, for example, but we did find it mentioned in a guide called Soissons Neuf's Gay Guide for 1949, which noted, quote, dykes were likely to be found. So it's just kind of, you get a little bit of a sense of that this was a queer space in the late 40s, early 50s. And gay guidebooks are also essential resources in documenting post-Stonewall spaces. The Love Boat was a gay bar popular with Latino gay men in Queens and is mentioned in Bob Damron's 1990 address book. And Blake already mentioned the Damron guides, and they began in the 1960s, and they cover lots of gay bars around the country. So it's another great resource. And the Love Boat is also a great example of piecing together queer history through gay guidebooks, which I've highlighted in green, oral histories highlighted in red, and archives highlighted in blue. And one of the sources is a comment left on one of our Instagram posts by a former patron of the Love Boat who talked about a stage that was pulled down from the wall, which made the space even smaller so that people had to cram up against the walls to fit. And then the tiny stage was made up mostly of Latina drag artists. So it was a really great comment. We were able to help fill in this history a little bit further, a little bit more. And it's not that long ago in the, the 80s and 90s, but it's still great to capture these memories when we can find them. Stepping back in time a bit, in the 1950s and 60s, queer people begin to organize with increased frequency by forming groups like the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. And they also start to control their own narratives by sending out newsletters to members around the country. And this includes The Ladder, which was the national newsletter of the Daughters of Bilitis that ran from 1956 to 1972. And those are still around to view. And so it's a really great resource. And it's a really important lifeline, as you can imagine, in that period, as we always say, before the internet. Someone in Kansas subscribes to this newsletter and they feel connected. And it was really important. And I picked this in particular because this is the this cover features Lily Vincenz, who we just talked about. Yeah. And the gay and lesbian press after Stonewall expands to include Gay Power, the Lesbian Tide, and just simply Gay, and other presses like this. And some of these are even available online. And Blake had shared the mappingthegayguides.com, which is really great. There's other LGBT Houston, blanking on the URL, but that's another one. So it's great that these are being digitized because they really open up a whole new narrative that you would not be finding in the popular or mainstream presses. And another important one is Black newspapers. They're really helpful for filling in the gaps in the narrative that weren't otherwise covered in mainstream, white newspapers. I've accessed them through ProQuest and newspapers.com. And for a separate project, the Library of Virginia has digitized a lot of African-American newspapers. And so Jimmy Daniels was the name of a popular Harlem supper club that was owned and operated by cabaret singer Jimmy Daniels from 1939 to 1942. And I wouldn't be surprised if people in Jackson Ward going up to Harlem stopped it. It was really popular. And so we knew that Daniels was openly gay and ran this place, but it wasn't until I came across a lot of articles in the New York Amsterdam News, which is a Black newspaper in New York, that I was able to get a much better idea of the space and who went there. And this quote gives you a really great sense that this was the place to be. So when Jimmy first came to Harlem a dozen or so years ago, he had no idea that someday he would be the toast of sophisticated circles on both sides of the Atlantic, and that he would number among his friends European royalty, the kings and queens of stage and screen, and the princes of industry. The story of Jimmy Daniels reads like something out of the book. And then if you're lucky, you'll find historic images of when whatever you're researching is actually still there in the early 40s. And then again in the 1980s, the city of New York had photos taken of every single lot in the city for tax purposes. And this, of course, now becomes such a gem for historians and other municipalities look to see if they're doing that. If they have those on record, they're incredible, especially this. Now we can see because the storefront doesn't look like this anymore. So we have a little bit of a sense of what it did look like. And then I happened to come across this on Instagram, this photo on the right. So social control, next. Police raids at police raids, are a factor, organized crime and liquor license laws. The state liquor authority could take away, so the state liquor authority of New York could take away a bar owner's liquor license for running a disorderly house. And the presence of gay men and lesbians at the bar was considered de facto disorderly. Even if you're just sitting there quietly having a drink, you are a problem. So you'll find stories like these reported in newspapers at the time that a bar lost its liquor license, and for these reasons. So you might look at newspapers in the 50s and 60s. The United States as a whole has become much more conservative, and there's a lot of crackdowns on bars that cater to queer people. And this kind of discrimination was challenged by members of the Mattachine Society in 1966, right here at Julius's, which is a gay bar in Greenwich Village that's still there. We end our walking tours there. It looks exactly inside the way it did in 1966. Stonewall inside has actually been, that's not what it looked like in 1969. So if you want a piece of history right here, this is definitely a place to visit. And this is part of a longer story, but the Mattachine members are pictured here being refused service by the bartender for being gay. And that's what they wanted. They wanted to capture this in real time. And then they brought photographers around just for that reason. And this has become quite an iconic photo. And one sympathetic story came from the Village Voice, which was a neighborhood newspaper. 3 homosexuals in search of a drink. And a homophobic one by the New York Times, 3 deviants invite exclusion by bars. So you can see the wording that you like, yeah. So there's that. Police raids at lesbian bars could often be sexually violent, and raids at places like the Sea Colony happen sometimes weekly. Yet women from this period will still say, this is the only place we really knew where to go in the 50s. So we would take that chance. And you have mafia, run bars, watered down drinks, high prices, a lot of surveillance, but they had no other option. So they went to these bars. And the Sea Colony was one of the most popular lesbian bars for working class lesbians in the 1950s and 1960s. And one of our former grad students was able to make a floor plan of the Sea Colony, which you see at the right. After speaking with a former bartender who described the space, which is really great because this is the 50s and 60s, this is a while back, so she was able to make contact with this person. And because of that, we're able to understand further what this space was like. And actually, for the longest time before we had this photo on the left, which was taken by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission when it was considering this area for historic district status in the 1960s, we just thought the bar was on the left. But this photo gave us a whole new perspective. And the floor plan, now you see when they talk about the dancing room in the back, we thought it meant the back over here. No, it's actually the row house to the right. And so what would happen is the bartender in the left room, when the police came in, would have a button that they'd press. And so people dancing in the back room would see a light go off, knew to separate, because you could be arrested for same-sex dancing. And it did happen. And next. And butch lesbians and those who today might identify as transmasculine were often most at risk of being arrested for wearing clothes that were not considered traditionally feminine. And they were taken to the nearby Women's House of Detention, this building in Greenwich Village, which has since been demolished. There's a book on this by Hugh Ryan about the Women's House of Detention, and he actually looked through a lot of records to learn that this was a large holding place for working class white and Black lesbian women and those who he has identified as transmasculine. And queer history, donated LGBTQ holdings and archival collections and oral histories are really great when you can find them. Queer history in some parts of New York City require a lot more effort. We had a grad student this summer, Cecilia, focus her research on identifying sites in the Bronx, like this one connected to Bronx United Gays, a group from the early 1970s. We had no idea that the activism had started in the Bronx that early, so that was another great find. Cecilia looked through several digital and in-person archives. The flyer on the left was found online through the Archives of Sexuality and Gender, which I can't recommend enough. It's amazing. And you'll find stuff there that you just didn't think could be found. It's really great. The flyer itself originated from the Lesbian Her Story Archives, which has a physical space in Brooklyn. And I believe their holdings extend beyond New York City subject matter. So that could be another great resource for you. And then on the right, and these two here, they're all from the New York Public Library, which has one of the largest queer archives in the world. And these are from the International Gay Information Center ephemera files. So some of these are really great, like be daring, be wicked, be nasty, be naughty, be nasty, break with tradition, dance on Sunday night. You can just get lost just reading flyers, honestly. So colleges and universities also have great resources, as Blake was sharing earlier, not only of queer history in general, but queer history that happened there. You have a lot of people, go away from home for the first time in a different city, feeling more liberated and have access to other people like them in community groups. And the Student Homophile League that was formed here in 1966 is believed to be the first gay student group in the country and possibly the world, forming here at Columbia and holding much of its activities in Earl Hall, this building. And Columbia's archives have some great finds, including this Pride of Lions publication from April 1972 with gay dance sitting on the alma mater statue. If you're familiar with the campus, it's pointing to Earl Hall. And because it's a college, you can look, if you find the name of the founder, you might be able to find them in the yearbook. And so that's what we did here with Robert Martin, who went by the name Stephen Donaldson, a bisexual sophomore who started this Student Homophile League. And these are just some great clippings from Columbia's archive, including a radio interview from 1967 and an all-college gay mixer, 1969, about 2 months before Stonewall. So you see that this queer life is already happening in New York, well before Stonewall. And we've also documented collectives like Transy House in Brooklyn, which was here from 1995 to 2008. It provided shelter for trans, gender variant, and non-binary people in need, especially for those who were turned away from men and women's shelters. I got lucky because there happened to be a documentary on the house itself, and it includes interviews from the two founders who are pictured at left. All the way at the left is Chelsea Goodwin, and holding the sign, "Not fooling anyone, just being who we are," is Rusty May Moore, who unfortunately died last year. I also looked through the book, The Riddle of Gender, Science, Activism, and Transgender Rights, which talked about this house. The founders also said they drew their inspiration from Star House. Star House existed in the early 1970s and was founded by Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who were two early and significant trans activists of color. They're here marching in the 1973 Pride March in New York. I'm just going to end with several layers of queer history in one of the most famous spots in New York, and that's Central Park. So going back to the 19th century, located in the heart of Central Park is the Angel of the Water statue at the Bethesda Terrace. So many people take photos of this statue, very happy to take it back to wherever they are in the world. They probably don't realize that it was done by the sculptor Emma Stebbins, standing in the photo next to her partner, actress Charlotte Cushman. Stebbins worked on the statue while living with Cushman in Rome in the 1860s, and they were part of a circle of lesbian artists called they called themselves the Female Jolly Bachelors. And the statue itself was the only sculpture sanctioned as part of the park's early design and construction phase, and was officially dedicated in 1873. And it was the first public work designed by a woman in New York City. Of course, there are many places in Central Park, not just Central Park, but we're talking about Central Park, that have been historically popular gay male cruising areas. And I don't know who took this photo, but it's in the collection of the LGBT Community Center National History Archive. They have a really great archive. They're located in Greenwich Village. I don't know how much of it is digitized, but it would be worth checking out. Records show that gay men were arrested here as early as 1921. I'm sure it goes back further than that. One of the most famous arrests would be future gay rights leader Harvey Milk, who in 1947 was arrested in the park for cruising. He had recently graduated from high school on Long Island. And by the 1980s, Central Park was in desperate need of landscape restoration. And helping to lead this effort were two gay men, landscape architects Philip N. Winslow up on the left and Bruce Kelly, pictured in front of the lake in Central Park. They oversaw the restoration of many areas of the park, although unfortunately they both later lost their lives to AIDS. And finally, the Sheep Meadow in Central Park was the endpoint of the very first Pride March in New York City, which took place on June 28th, 1970, which was intentionally set on that date to be the one-year anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, to commemorate that uprising. And these posters come from a donated collection at the University of Connecticut, which just shows that you shouldn't just look locally to uncover local history. Marchers began their route near the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village and walked 3 miles north to the Sheep Meadow in Central Park. And this past summer, I interviewed Ellen Brody, I mentioned this earlier, talking about what it was like to plan that march, what it was like to be in that march. And we have that recording on our website. And we've also embedded this great video, Gay and Proud, once again, Lilieve and Jens, who documented through video that first Pride March of all of them walking up 6th Avenue and into Central Park. It's an incredible timepiece that's now housed at the Library of Congress. And then finally, the Gay Bee in the Sheep Meadow, which at that point was the largest public gathering of openly queer people ever. And this photo was taken by Diana Davies, who took lots of incredible photos in the 1970s that are now housed at the New York Public Library. And they're digitizing more and more of those every day. They're really great snapshots of this period. When I was looking through a gay and lesbian Richmond book, you see in the early 70s some groups from Richmond going up to march in New York. So there's a lot of different groups coming together to march together. So this is just a really great shot in the park. And this is just information if you'd like to learn more about our project and all that. So thank you. Does anyone have any questions before we go to the next section? Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to just like really quick thing to figure out? Back up. Okay, so we want to make sure there's a lot of time for discussion and to hear about the work that you all are doing. But just very briefly, Amanda and I have been working together on a project here in Richmond that gives a nice kind of case study for how to get at some of the resources that are out there, and I think pulls some of the threads of what we've both been talking about in terms of the information that you can access. So Tony Segura and Marsh Harris, these are two individuals who lived here in the museum district, and we decided a little bit over a year ago to begin working on a National Register of Historic Places eligibility determination report for their house. That's a mouthful of words. It essentially means starting the process of getting their house listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It would be the first LGBTQ historic thing in Virginia to be listed on the registers, and it's kind of representative of all of this documentation and survey that we've done of important queer spaces throughout the state, kind of picking that up to the next level. So we've documented many things, and now we're beginning to look at those that we might want to carry forward to this higher level of documentation, which is designation through the register program. So why Tony Segura and Marsh Harris? Tony Segura was one of the most important leaders of what Amanda was just telling you about, that homophile movement, which was pre-Stonewall, more 1950s, early queer activism. Lived in New York, from Cuba, immigrated to the US in 35, I believe, lived in New York. His residence is on NYC LGBT Sites webpage, and then moved down to Richmond in 1959 after having started a Managing Society chapter in New York City. Came down to Richmond to work for Philip Morris. He was an engineer, chemical engineer. Moved here in 1959, if I remember correctly. And I'm going to be looking to Amanda, because Amanda did a lot of the writing and research on this project, and tried really hard to start possibly a Managing Society or another early queer activism group here in Richmond in the 1950s. We weren't quite there yet, weren't quite ready. Later in the 1960s and 70s, he did become one of the leaders of kind of the nascent LGBTQ rights activity here in the city. Helped to found the Richmond Gay Rights Association, which was one that organized the 1974 Anita Bryant protest, that first public LGBTQ activism here in, really in Virginia, in Monroe Park, with the exception of the 1965 protest at the Pentagon. Also helped to organize our first Pride Festival, which was in 1979 in Byrd Park. Wrote for several periodicals associated with the association, the GRA newsletter. Again, these were really important news sources and places for people getting information in the 70s. And a lot of the planning for these events, a lot of the writing that he did, all took place in the home that he shared with Marsh Harris. He met Marsh Harris in the early 1960s at Eaton's, which was a gay bar downtown. It still stands. It's not a bar anymore, but the building still stands, and we have documented it. And Marsh Harris was very impressive on his own, very withdrawn, reserved socially, not as involved in kind of the activism side of things, although he was supporting it financially. But he was an important gay pulp fiction author. He was writing gay pulp fiction in the 1960s primarily. That was a time when there was quite a market for pulp fiction in general, as well as geared towards queer folks. And what set his writing apart is that a lot of pulp fiction kind of had tales of transgression and characters who would wind up with sort of disastrous endings. And his wasn't that. It was queer love stories that almost always had happy endings. There were elements of magic realism and mythology. They're really beautiful to read. A lot of them are available online. This is one of his publications. He wrote under the pen name Peter Randolph, and a lot of that writing was happening in their house in the museum district as well. So we were able to make contact with the owners of the property through friends of a friend. And we reached out to them to ask if they'd be interested in us starting this National National Register documentation process for them. They were really excited. And Amanda, do you want to talk a little bit about like the research side of things?
Yeah, so we needed to first, actually Blake found the address, and that's where we started with, and then we need to figure out, okay, when did they live here? So here's some of the resources that we came across. We have a directory here, and Ancestry.com is really helpful with census records. And
death records.
And death records.
Helped us to show where they were living when Tony Segura died.
Yeah, and in the case of Marsh Harris, it was interesting. He was actually born in North Carolina, but there was, if you look at some of the resources, people thought that he was born in India. So it's an interesting kind of maybe perhaps connection to his author kind of vibe. So we'll have to look into that. But and that we also, I was able to, looking at Lesbian and Gay Richmond, the book, looking at the sources they used and going from there, that was a great starting point. And I was able to go to VCU and look through the Bob Swisher papers, which has a lot of content for LGBTQ history to access. And also outhistory.org has a whole section on Richmond history, so that helped as well. And I also, speaking about not just looking locally for local history, I went up to the New York Public Library. There was an interview that Tony Segura did with a really noted gay historian, Jonathan Ned Katz, in the late 70s. And in part of it, he talks about Richmond and moving down to Richmond and his experiences there. So that was really great. It was great to hear his voice, too. And then I had a colleague at Cornell who was able to access the books by Marsh Harris, and he took those photos that we just saw of Sextet. So that was really helpful as well.
Awesome. And here's the house. It stands within kind of the west end of the museum district, has wonderful historic integrity. And again, the owners have been so enthusiastic throughout this process. But what's important for the National Register component of this project is that the house really does still reflect how it looked and how it would have functioned during Segura and Harris's time there. And they only died in 1991. So, this was mid-century through the late 90s, or the early 90s, although we were really focusing in on their activism and the writing that was happening in the 60s through the 70s. And when you're talking about Bob Swisher, it brought up an interesting conversation that we are having, I think is worth sharing with this group, which is that the Bob Swisher papers are amazing. It's this one man's kind of accounting of gay life in Richmond in the 50s and 60s, more or less, available here in town. But it is just that. It's one man's perspective. And a conversation that we had was that Bob Swisher's impression was that there were no bar raids happening in Richmond in the 1960s. When you look at other sources, you find out actually they were happening a lot. And so, always something to keep in mind if you're looking at someone's, personal narrative or letters they're writing, that they're talking about their experience, and that is part of a larger whole. So just wanted to add that in. And we have more here. Well, here's the very boring state document that this all winds up on. It is publicly available on our webpage. This is that kind of first step towards National Register listing. And this goes to several internal committees for approval. It went to an initial committee that said, yes, we think this is eligible for the National Register. And then actually just last week, it went to our Board of Historic Resources at one of our quarterly board meetings, and they confirmed that this property is eligible for the National Register. So I'm now looking at some funding sources to potentially take it to that next step. But just a little insight for you all about how this research happened in an actual kind of case study setup. Do you want to go now, or should we open it up?
What do you think, Marianne? Do you want to do our last little bit?
Yeah, we'll do our resources, and then we'll just
we don't want to have you guys wait too long. Get onto the Library Virginia website and all right. Yeah. So the last little bit we're going to do is we're going to show you the queer history research guide that we've created for Library of Virginia. And this can kind of hopefully moving forward and, with everything we've learned today, but whatever we discussed today, it's kind of a good starting place, whether you're doing research here at Library of Virginia on our website or even elsewhere, to try to like, so you don't have to feel like you have to frantically write down everything you just learned. It has a lot of good resources about those topics.
You have to navigate
Oh,
through up
God.
here. Yeah.
Okay, this is horrifying. Okay. I can do this. All right.
Do you
Um,
need to click
No,
through?
I think I'm fine. All right, so I wanted to start on our homepage because I actually want to show you all of our research guides, and then I'm going to talk a little, and then Marianne's going to finish us off with some archival resources. So when you're on our homepage, if you are doing research with us, we have this For Researchers tab. And then you are going to be looking for the link that says Research Guides and Indexes. So these are guides and other resources that we have put together. So we are the State Library and the State Archive. We have a lot of government records for state government and local government, but we also have things that have been donated. We have newspapers, we have books. And so while I'm going to focus on showing you the Queer History Research Guide, a lot of the stuff that was just talked about touches on all sorts of different types of records. So we have African American resources, we have Indigenous resources, we have information about searching newspapers, we have information about records that people use for like genealogy and family and local history. Those are all going to be records that you're going to be using if you are doing queer history research. But let's go ahead and go to this Virginia history section, and I'll show you this guide that we put together. We again put this together last year, and it is trying not to be, as comprehensive as it can without being too long, just an overview of what's here in the building, but again, what's also available online and in other institutions. So I'm going to point out a few sections. Before I start clicking around, I did want to say that every single one of our research guides should have a link to how to contact us. So as a reference librarian, we have a reference department. So those are the people that when you have research questions, you can contact us and get help. For any of these, whether or not it's even in our collection, always look for this contact us, and always know that you can email us, you can call us during business hours. Please reach out and ask questions. We field all sorts of questions. That's literally our entire job if we are doing reference. So don't feel like you can't ask for help when you get stuck, because there might be some intricacy to how our collections are organized or where to find things that we know that, again, we try to put as much as possible on the website, but we can't put everything. So the different sections of this guide, we made sure to have a section about research strategies that talks about some of the topics that have come up about trying to find these hidden histories when they are, especially pre-Stonewall. Sometimes they're overt, sometimes they're not. So this is just a starting point, and I certainly recommend that you read books, that you seek out other sources about how to do this research, or again, ask us for help. One thing that we tried to actually focus on is when you are searching the archives or when you are searching books or newspapers, often you have to either think like a librarian or an archivist, or you have to think like the people in the time period. So there are search terms that we recommend if you are searching our library catalog or searching our archival finding aids. Those have been created, over the last several decades, and there are very standardized terms that we use that are not necessarily the terms you and I would use for some of these identity categories, behaviors, and communities. So some of them are very familiar, but some of them are like a little bit more niche or even outdated, but they're still on our records because those are still standard terminology. And even as we're updating them, sometimes they don't get updated right away. So sometimes, you might put in a term that makes sense to you, but if you don't get any results or not the results you are expecting, try some of these other terms instead. Some of them are, again, you would really have to be a professional to know them, like sexual minority, not something that we use anymore, but that was the state of our term, I'm assuming, in like kind of 80s, 90s. And then if you are searching the full text of original documents, so like when you're searching a newspaper archive online, often you can search the full text. It's not perfect, but you can type in the words that you expect to appear in the article. That's where you're going to be looking for the original terminology that they were using at the time. And sometimes there wasn't necessarily a like queer community, or sometimes there was, but they're using totally different language. So this is definitely not comprehensive, but here are some, contemporary terms that we might recognize. But then we also tried to pull out some of the historical terms that were used at different times, different places, different communities, like homophile, which was so common in the 50s and 60s. And some of these terms refer to what we would think of as like sexual orientation. Some of them refer to gender identity, and some of them really refer to both because there was a lot of overlap between those categories, especially in like the 19th century or earlier. And then finally, we have some basic information about how to interpret these documents. And there's like, a lot of schools of thought on this. But as we've said, sometimes it's not always explicit. Sometimes it's more veiled. Sometimes at the same time, it's more explicit than you would think. And people do, tell these stories very openly. But it's framed in a way that does not seem familiar to us. So especially the more research you do, you're going to start to see the patterns at, again, specific time periods of how people talked about different types of identities and communities and relationships. I'm also going to show a couple things down here. So we have published sources. We have basically information about accessing published sources. So Marianne's going to talk a little bit about the newspaper section, but we do have books here at the library. We also have interlibrary loans. So if there's a book that you can't get access to and you are here in Richmond, you can contact us. We have free interlibrary loans, so we could try to get pretty much anything for you, and you can take it home and read it. I always like to let people know about that. We have scholarly databases like JSTOR that if you have a free library card with us, you can access, and you can get a lot of those databases at home. Again, we have newspapers and newsletters that Marianne's going to talk about. And then I'm going to be talking a little bit about state documents. Again, as the State Library and Archive, that's a lot of what we do. So it's a lot about kind of criminalizing queer identities, policing them, but also providing civil rights, providing services. So we do have documents that were like created by state agencies. So not necessarily a huge amount, but certainly like a main one that I was able to identify is we do have a lot of documents related to the HIV/AIDS crisis, especially in the early decades of that. So if you were researching the history of that, you could definitely come here and read some of those publications. I also tried to provide a little overview to the legal history, which can get really complicated depending on how familiar you are with doing legal research. So this is where I would definitely recommend you reach out if you're interested in doing any type of legal research, because we can definitely guide you through that. But there's a timeline on here that kind of gives a timeline of different statutes that are related to queer identities and queer experiences, as well as important cases that were decided in Virginia, either at the state or federal level. So just because there's so much, we have 400 years of, history after colonization, there's so much information, and thinking through of like how government works, whether it was the state that was criminalizing it, whether it was going up to federal courts because it was a civil rights issue, or something I would actually like to learn more about, but I have just a couple mentions, are like local ordinances. Often we see people getting arrested for things, and it's hard to figure out if there was actually a law against like cross-dressing. I haven't really found a lot of cross-dressing laws, but there seems to have been some local ordinances. So like the city deciding it didn't want people to be doing that behavior, or even common law where it's not written down, it's just a precedent that people have decided to criminalize it over time. So that's all there. And then I did want to mention that there is this link at the bottom to other archives within Virginia and beyond. And so often people are moving from state to state, or newspapers or publications or archives outside of the state. They have materials or information related to Virginia. So I would like to do a lot more looking at some of the digitized newspapers in other states to see what they do have, because we have so much good stuff in our newspaper collections, but I bet there's a lot more in some of those online repositories that do cover us.
Okay, I'm really gonna kind of fly through some of this. I'm happy to answer more questions, but I want you guys to be able to especially ask Blake and Amanda questions while they're here. In terms of private papers, well, we have three main archival sections here at the library. We have private papers, which are kind of your traditional, what you think of like an archive, where it's donated by a person or we've purchased by some means. And this is where we don't have like a really great hold on like really what we have, because we don't have a lot of private papers that are overtly, how they would fall in queer history. But we do have some that we've kind of recognized as having some substantial subject matter. In terms of our other two big areas are local government records and state government records. And local government records, we have a lot of it, but again, we haven't really specifically delved into really trying to unearth everything that we have in it. But some places that we kind of identified as places to kind of start your searching are criminal records. We have a lot of case records from numerous localities. Mostly what we have kind of here on site are records that are up until 1913. Everything kind of after that is a little bit hit or miss as to if we have it on site. But if we don't have it on site, it's likely that they still may exist in the locality's courthouse. But these are some charges and stuff that we've identified as being potential areas to look at when kind of going through these records. Another area are divorce cases, which are usually in Chancery records. And for the most part, a lot of our Chancery records are digitized and available through our Chancery Records Index. And here you'll kind of see the impetus for divorce cases. A lot of it is usually pretty veiled, but you will see kind of these instances of either intersexuality or people not performing their marital duties. And it takes some of that innuendo-ish type reading with some of these, but we have some pretty good examples of that in our divorce cases. Personal documentation. This is an area where we would like to dive in a little bit more to see one of our really kind of exceptional examples of this is a petition by Lawrence Register Payne. This is who was formerly Lydia Payne. This is kind of a really great, awesome story that is available on our blog, and our blog information is up there. So I would encourage you to look there and you can find the whole story yourself, but very interesting. But succeeds and formally changes their name from Lydia to Lawrence. Our other main area is state records. And this is probably where you'll find a lot of what we have, because as has been mentioned, as the state agency responsible for, collecting other state agency stuff, that is the perspective and the records that we mostly have is from, kind of, for lack of a better term, the oppressor side of things. So a lot of what we have ABC records. So all the raids and all that kind of stuff that everyone else has kind of talked about. We have them. We have the ABC stuff. So when they get the license revoked, it's in the minute books. When the stuff gets rated, it's sometimes indicated in the order books and stuff. So it's an interesting place to kind of see that side of how this is all being approached. And our governor's records, we've identified some of the administrations that have holdings kind of related to this. A lot of what is there is sometimes policy, sometimes in constituent letters and correspondence too. But it is a little all over the place depending on the administration. You'll see a lot of stuff related to handling the AIDS epidemic in these records as well. And then we have some other record types, particularly mental health records. We have most of the records pertaining to all of the major state hospitals in the state, and especially some of the more, I guess, historical admission records, you can definitely see like when people are admitted that they're admitted for sexual deviancy, they're admitted for, I'm trying to remember one good one. It was literally something like for like feminine gazing or something. It was like something like very interesting that you're like, oh, okay. So that kind of gives like a point of information to then like kind of identify a person and then maybe examine how that route goes. We also have penitentiary records, and that is a little bit all over the place. Sometimes, it's the charge itself that brings people here. And then sometimes there are disciplinary actions that take place while in the penitentiary that, have some of this queer content in it. One of the more interesting, and we have some examples of this up here, are from our unclaimed property records. Once, the deceased has unclaimed property, as stipulated, it goes to the Department of the Treasury, and then after 25 years, it can then be transferred to us if it has, we're able to assess if it has historic value. So we've gotten several collections through the unclaimed property area that are literally safety deposit boxes filled of correspondence, of pictures, of all kinds of records related to how they lived a very gay life in a lot of instances. And those are probably some of the more like really truly like humanizing records that we have, because it is the stuff that they clearly didn't really want to share with the rest of the world. And then, like I said, we have ABC records, and this is a huge amount of material from the board itself, from record books to minute books to index books, scrapbooks. So there are loose records, there are bound volumes, and just a lot of stuff relating to. It takes a lot of intricate navigating in some cases, as sometimes stuff is identifiable by who owned the property, not necessarily the name of the business. So it takes a little research on research with some of this stuff. So that's kind of our archival. And then kind of under that, we have our newspaper collections. And in this, as was brought up earlier, our own community, we have the full run of that available through Virginia Chronicle as well. And so this is a very cool one to just kind of flip through and peruse. We also have a pretty full run of Richmond Pride. And there's not a lot of these, so you can actually probably like spend an afternoon and kind of like go through this. But speaking of Bob Swisher, he did a lot of little vignette type articles in here. So here's a kind of very accessible way to get to some of his personal reminiscing, but he also does kind of quasi interviews with like other local people. But we have those as kind of our main overt kind of queer newspapers. But this is probably one of the main resources that we have to get to earlier kind of examples of queer history. So like Amanda was saying, yes, this is where we can see like in the newspapers, like a lot of these kind of using those historical terms lists that we kind of pulled together. You can find quite a lot of references to masquerading as Here's some early references to drag and drag balls, and all kinds of stuff like that that will not get you, super far back, but there's a lot of stuff probably starting in about the 1880s that you start to see become more and more frequent throughout this. So this is like a really great resource if you're looking kind of for that pre-Stonewall, pre 1950s era of examples and stuff.
Thank you. You've been an amazing attentive.